another event in a series of events visiting scholars of color, that a program that Sean Harper and I coordinate for the school. We get a lot of excellent help from Diana Johnson in that regard. And, it's a program that I feel very strongly about. Just thinking about it, I started a program like this at Michigan State about 30-some years ago. And then I went to Wisconsin and started it there. And went to Vanderbilt and I started there. And came to Penn. I started it here. I'm retiring this spring, so maybe that's why I'm thinking about this. I guess maybe I'll start one in my retirement. How that's going to work. But I mention all of this by way of saying that I do hope that this program will continue. I have no way to promise that. But if it did, or if I wasn't retiring this spring, then I would invite each one of you, the program for this year is set, to send to myself or Sean people that you think would be great to have here because you admire their scholarship. And the nomination can be, oh, and here's Sean speaking of the devil. And I'm just inviting, I'm saying if we continue this program next year, which I dearly hope we will, that they should be thinking, so you should just go along through life and say, oh, I just read somebody's work, or I just saw this person and I really admire them, and I'd like to have them around. It's hard to hire somebody. You got to have a job first, and then you got to convince them to take it. But you can get almost anybody for 2 days. It's a beautiful thing. We get the best of the price. Say if I tried to hire him, he'd probably say, forget about it. Again, 2 days, sure. So anyway, keep that in mind, will you please? And it's good to have a name and a bio or a CV. But these days with Google, if we just have a name, we can probably get the rest of the stuff ourselves. So today, it's my great pleasure to introduce Derrick Darby. Thank you so much for being here, Derrick, and spending some time with us. He is a professor at the University of Kansas, and he's got a joint appointment. He's a philosopher by training. So his undergraduate is from Cornell in philosophy.
Colgate.
Oh, Colgate. Right, I had to see.
Yeah.
Oh, I got to see that. Colgate, but he's a philosopher by training. Then he got his doctorate in philosophy at the University of Pittsburgh. But he's in the law school as well as philosophy at Kansas. So it's a pretty unique thing. He got there. He got there by way of Northwestern and Texas A&M. So that's great. And I would just read from his bio that his main areas of research are social and political philosophy and philosophy of education, with a focus on rights, race, inequality, and social justice. And I think it's a perfect fit for us. I know that when I ask people who are here what it was that drew them to Penn GSE, almost always I hear the word social justice. I think of all the places I've been, it's more, it permeates more of the very essence of who we are and how we think about ourselves. So with that, I'll just say thank you again for being here, and I look forward to your talk.
Okay. Thanks so much to Dean Porter and Sean Harper for gracious invitation to spend a little time with you folks this afternoon for our lunch break. And and thanks to class that's in attendance. And I'm going to see if I can maybe condense things just a little bit so we might have a little time for exchange. Start with this question: Should we pay underachieving students cash for grades to close the racial achievement gap. We put virtually everything else up for sale, and we think money can buy just about everything we need, so why not try to use money to solve this problem in this way? Well, this provocative research question put Harvard economist Roland Fryer in the national spotlight. And this question also sparked my interest in the area of philosophy of education. Fryer's work is most famously, as some of you may know, associated with the Cash for Grades intervention to close the achievement gap. But one of the things that I found most striking about Fryer's work when I came across it, maybe it's been about 6 years now, is his emphasis on the importance of using data to drive or to bring about social change. So he emphasized that his concern was to basically have data-driven interventions. Now, for him, this meant a couple of things. It obviously meant that we had to document the achievement gaps, okay? We had to document it and display it. And we also had to explain these gaps. And when he started working on this topic, as you all know, some of you know at least, he was very interested in the phenomenon of acting white, or the so-called peer effect. And he was working on a hypothesis that this had something to do with helping us understand the racial achievement gap. And so, as a social scientist, very good one in fact, he used his methodology to help test this hypothesis, collected data, got lots of funding, but you need funding to do experiments, don't you? You'll see this is why ultimately I'm just a philosopher. We don't need a lot of funding, this is a good thing. So we can work without it. The talk really is going to help show that we can have some things to say without that type of backing. But anyway, I was very fascinated with Fryer's effort to, as he put it, use science in the service of social change. Now, when we think more generally about the so-called racial achievement gap, we find, among other things in the literature, people who have documented the achievement gap. So we find racial gaps in educational achievement and attainment, test scores, GPA, representation, advanced placement, honors, dropout, suspension rates, enrollment in special education, college, and so forth and so on. And all of you can just dig up the relevant research material on that. Like I don't have to display any of that on the slide because we can go look that up. They're good people who have been documenting these disparities for some time. Now, arguably, the achievement gap became an object of federal policy in 1965 with Title I of the Elementary and Secondary School Education Act, which put the national spotlight on poverty and issues of achievement gaps, made it a federal funding priority. And it continues to be an object of concern with the various successors to that legislation, No Child Left Behind, and its various sort of versions. So we've got people who documented the achievement gap along many different measures. We have the achievement gap being an object of federal policy. And then we have, interestingly, a lot of debate in the research literature on the causes of the achievement gap. Now, this is where it gets interesting. So my initial sort of introduction to this area, as I said, came through Fryer's work. And I noticed he was spending a lot of time with this peer effect explanation of achievement. And I just couldn't help but to think this seems a bit simple. Surely this can't be the source of the problem. But you know, he had data and he had very sophisticated empirical analysis that he was bringing to bear on. But what this sort of, as I dug deeper, this led me to see that there are mainly three competing kinds of explanations that are offered for why there is a racial and ethnic achievement gap. Here's a way to characterize it. One kind of explanation, and people use different language for this, but this language will probably be familiar to most of you. One species of explanation is what you might call a structural explanation. And these explanations often point to things like discrimination or lack of resources or the way opportunity is structured in allocating benefits and burdens. And these explanations are also politically most often associated with people on the left, and whatever that means. But people on the left typically tend to advocate structural explanations of the racial achievement gap. And notice what I'm saying, I'm talking about the racial achievement gap, but we could have a broader discussion about racial inequality generally and find the same kinds of explanations. Another kind of explanation is what some people often refer to as cultural explanations of the achievement gap. Here we might talk about some of the kinds of things that came up when I looked at Fryer's work, right? Is there an anti-achievement attitude among youth? Does that account for why they don't do as well? People refer to the significance of people's choices or their effort, their relationship to the work ethic, the phenomenon of acting white, family background, for example. It's a big bag of things, right, that go here typically. And then there are people who basically advocate for some kind of mixed explanation that combines the cultural and the structural factors. So, looking at Fryer's work, I got the sense that the kind of explanation he was advocating was more in the cultural vein. It was sort of discussed that way. Seemed a bit simple. And that led me to see that there were these different varieties of explanation that we found in the empirical literature. Now, here's the other thing that occurred to me. I was fascinated by this discussion. I was introduced to it by looking at some very sophisticated quantitative work by an economist. And it led me to wonder, well, what can I contribute to this conversation as a humanist? Well, in this case, I mean, not just any kind of humanist, but Dean Porter told you I got a PhD in philosophy. I didn't know what I was going to do with it at the time, of course. Nobody ever knows what they're going to do with philosophy, but fortunately it worked out for me. I got lucky. But here are a couple of research questions that occurred to me. General question. What can humanists contribute to our understanding of the racial achievement gap? What can we bring to the table? Is there any evidence that we can offer on its causes and effects? What are the possible payoffs of such a contribution? And might this evidence inform educational policy and practice in the post-civil rights era? So as I got introduced to this problem and I looked at the existing literature, one of the things I was struck by was that it was largely dominated by social scientists, data-driven social scientists, and particularly quantitative as opposed to qualitative ones in many instances. And many of the broader discussions in public policy and law were very much informed by the scholarship of these quantitative social scientists. I mean, Fryer's work is just a good case in point. If you go back and you look at some of the articles in the Times and various venues, you can see the way his work was used to help frame a public discussion about the achievement gap and to bring this cash for grades intervention into broader conversation. And it was also very well funded, in fact. And so this was all good. No problem with that. But what I did have a problem with was, as a philosopher, what seemed to be like a very reductionist approach to this problem that was really a very sophisticated problem, as we know now, obviously. When you think about the various social determinants that impact people's educational outcomes, right? How does that sort of factor in to this empirical understanding and analysis that we were getting? And how does this sort of connect up with broader questions of justice? Now, thinking about that and those sets of questions, right, led me to want to reflect a bit about the diversity of explanations of the achievement gap. And one of the things that I was struck by, as I looked more broadly in the literature within education in particular, and in the literature on racial inequality more generally, I was struck by the dominance of cultural explanations in our post-civil rights, or some might say post-racial era. These cultural explanations tended to dominate the landscape. Now, this is a significant point, I think, when you think generally about how we think about the demands of social justice today, 2013 in the United States, for sure. So there's a kind of story that you might want to tell. And the story would start with pointing out that this nation was founded on a set of broad normative ideals: freedom, justice, equality. When you look at the preamble to the Constitution, Declaration of Independence, you look at some of the literature of that time, and you'll see straight away that these ideals played an important role in the establishment of this nation. Now, you'll also see at the same time that this nation was, from its inception, one that was built upon slave labor. And so slavery is something that goes as far back as the ideals themselves. And in effect, what this did was this created a tension. How can you be a nation that professes to be about these broad, inclusive, seemingly inclusive ideals, but at the same time has made the subordination of human beings a reality in the polity? This is the tension. This is the so-called American dilemma that was there from the founding. So what happens is, I'm not a historian, but we've read the relevant bits of history. We have, obviously, you have a great colleague here, Roger Smith, masterful work, Civic Ideals, will give you a real thick accounting of some of these tensions and dilemmas. You've got these founding normative ideals, you've got slavery. And so eventually we get to the abolition of slavery, right? It's going to take some time, but we get there. And so that was a significant moment in the history of the nation where it took a very concrete step toward making good on these broad, inclusive ideals. Now, of course, after slavery, you ultimately get Reconstruction, the South, and you get a form of apartheid put in place. And then that also created a tension between the ideals and the practice. And so there was room now for another moment of progress, which we eventually got. And here in the School of Education, we know that Brown versus Board of Education was a significant moment in that part of our history of undoing racial segregation of schooling. Along with Brown, we had the Civil Rights Movement, Great Society programs. Now, this moment was interesting because with this moment, many people thought, finally, at long last, we finally have made good now on the ideals of freedom, justice, and equality for all by undoing the last vestiges of state-sponsored formal discrimination on the basis of race, we've now made America a place where people now really do have equality in a robust sense. Now, at that point, right, philosophers now get to do something they like to do. We get to make distinctions. This is kind of, see, we make distinctions. It's more or less what we do. We make distinctions and then we draw various inferences from it. So there's room to make an important distinction here. If you ask yourself, did America truly achieve equality after the Civil Rights era? And you say yes, then chances are you're thinking that equality was essentially about formal equality. It's about undoing Jim Crow and the overt manifestation of racism, discrimination. If you say no, then you can think a couple of things. You can think that America tried to undo formal inequality, but it didn't succeed. And then you can say, look, we still got discrimination. It's different a bit, but we still have it. You could tell that story. Or you might say, well, look, maybe we made a lot of progress in eliminating formal discrimination. But that's not the issue. The issue are the substantive inequalities in educational outcomes, in income, in wealth, in rates of incarceration, or what Michelle Alexander might call the new Jim Crow. At that point, we might start pointing out all of the measures along which blacks, Latinos, people of color generally, are substantively unequal when measured against whites. Now, of course, this need not just be a story about race, but it has to be a story about race to start. And that's part of what I want to suggest here. I know we all got to talk about class, and it's complicated, and poverty, yeah, we got all that. Don't think I don't know that. So the point is we've got this distinction between formal equality and substantive equality. Many people claim that formal equality is sufficient for fairness or equity. If you've got that, then you've got equity in as full-blooded of a sense as you can hope for. Now, what's interesting is that social inequalities, substantive inequalities in income and wealth and education came to ultimately be associated with culture or with people's, I don't know what's going on here. But I don't know if I'm supposed to ignore it. But maybe we don't need it. We can cut it off if he's going to do that to us. We can just cut it off if it's going to be a problem. Substantive inequality came to be associated with things that go under the heading of cultural explanation. So you remember I started out, the point I want to make here is tell a little story about why cultural explanations came to be dominant in thinking about the achievement gap, and more broadly thinking about racial inequality. Now, how did this happen? Well, all of us in the School of Education know about the 1966 Coleman Report. So basically the government said, look, we're thinking about putting all this money into public education. Is this going to be money well spent? Can directing resources to public education solve this problem? And a very famous study was commissioned, and the grand conclusion of the study was, that's not going to do it. Throwing money at this problem is not going to fix it, because what we find is we got to look at parents' level of education, particularly the mother, and then we have to look at family background. And that is really the important determinant of students' educational outcomes. And that became the paradigm. And it did a number of things for us. It focused on what nowadays people want to call culture, but it also put social science at the center of the discussion for understanding the achievement gap. It put social science, it put big data at the center of the discussion. Now, when data became the center of this discussion, it was then called upon to think about the kinds of interventions that we should be making as a society to deal with this problem. And so if you think the problem is essentially a cultural one, then you're going to have interventions that sort of reflect that. And you also then ultimately had a shift away from more structural kinds of interventions to more market-based interventions, for example. You had a retreat from Brown in the jurisprudence of the Supreme Court in a string of cases that some of you I know will be familiar with. And then you ultimately get something like an incentive model, right? Let's just pay the kids, because the problem is that they're conflicted. They got their peers, their low achieving peers, that are putting pressure on them to keep it black. So they don't want to raise their hand in class, or they don't want to carry the math book home. And so if we incentivize them in the right way, then maybe they'll be able to resist these low achieving peers that are trying to pull them down. And so get that intervention to try to help that. Now, of course, we know that there are skeptics, a lot of skeptics, who, one, deny that the U.S. has ultimately resolved this tension between its ideals and practices. As I said, some people deny it because they say we haven't yet achieved formal equality. So somebody whose work I know some of you will be familiar with in the School of Ed is Rosalind Mickelson, right? So when is, she raises the question, when is the racial achievement gap not a matter of discrimination, right? That's how she starts the conversation. There are some people that say, well, we have made some progress in achieving formal equality, but there's still too much substantive inequality. There's too much of a disparity in educational outcomes for achievement and for attainment. And so given the scope and the extent of these disparities, we can't yet rest easy with the thought that we've realized our normative aspirations. But to sustain these arguments in this day and age, in this so-called post-civil rights, post-racial era, you've got to reckon with these cultural explanations. Now, people have different ways of doing this. They say, well, culture doesn't really matter, so they take the hard line, like my dear colleague down at Duke, Sandy Derrick, whose work you may be familiar with, an economist. Some people might say culture alone doesn't matter, and then they try to tell a story that combines them. I mean, I think some of William Julius Wilson's recent work has done that, has tried to combine those two things. Some people have argued, look, even if it does matter, society is still on the hook because somehow these choices are compromised or diminished because of the circumstances that people find themselves in, right? So you have these skeptics. Now the other thing that you'll know, you can just turn that off. Yep. The other thing that you'll know is that social scientists have basically taken the lead here too in rebutting these cultural explanations. So when I study these cultural explanations, I see too that the social scientists, the work that they're doing, and some people are doing, excellent work. I know you've had people come through here like Carl O'Connor, Tyson, people who are doing really, Prudence Carter, people doing really good, important work in this area. But they've led the charge mainly in rebutting these explanations. Now, if this debate can only be engaged by quantitative or in some cases qualitative researchers, then humanists are going to have to sit it out. We're going to have to sit on the sidelines and cheer on our preferred social scientists. We're going to have to be cheerleaders, basically. Now, some of us, however, present company included, relish a good intellectual battle. I hate the idea of having to sit this one out and cheer on my favorite social scientists and the data that I like that data that she has. That's the kind of data I want to use to draw my conclusions. Well, if the goal is to challenge the prevailing cultural explanations of the racial achievement gap, how can a philosopher contribute to that project? How can a philosopher, and in my case, a historian who I'm collaborating with, contribute to this project? Well, here's the answer. by supplying a philosophically informed historical narrative that traces the social construction of the racial achievement gap. To locate the achievement gap philosophically and historically along a continuum of interconnected ideas about race, racial differences, and egalitarian justice, and to show that how this has shaped and supported the creation and perpetuation of inegalitarian social relations and unequal distributions with consequences that remain with us to this day. So, what I want to share with you today, just a little bit of, is a book that I am co-authoring with a colleague at the School of Education, the University of Kansas, John Rury, educational historian. And we're working on this book on the achievement gap that's bringing together a philosopher and a historian to put the achievement gap in this broader historical philosophical context. Now, what are going to be the payoffs? A couple things to think about. One, it's going to certainly give us some more ammunition against cultural explanations as sufficing to help us understand the achievement gap. And if there is a causal story to be told, and I know social scientists are very careful. Most people who talk about social scientific research are not as careful as the social scientists are. They'll tell you, look, we do correlations, we don't do causation. But people take that stuff, they say, well, this shows that follows from that. But they're more careful than that. They do correlations. But if there is some kind of causal story to be told about why the contemporary achievement gap outcomes look the way they do, then understanding the ideological and historical construction of this gap has to be part of the story. It gives some of you folks do policy, or you're going to do policy. I don't do policy. But it's going to hopefully give you people some additional evidence, and it is evidence of a certain sort, to consider when addressing and pursuing policy interventions. Now, the other thing it does is interesting, is it facilitates the importance of attitudinal shifts needed to get detracking reform off the ground. And this is a recent thing. I was going to put this up on, but I'll just maybe read it to you. Excellent collection that just came out by Carter and Wellman, Closing the Opportunity Gap. And there's a piece in there by Tyson that makes this very interesting point. Let me just read it to you. She says, although the change in the curricular structure is a key component of the student's achievement, such change is not likely to be successful without concomitant changes in instructional methods and in the beliefs and dispositions of school and district administrators, teachers, and other adults. Educators must change the way they think about intelligence, as well as what they think about students from low-income and minority backgrounds. If the adults at school believe that intelligence is fixed rather than malleable, or that race, income, and social class determine students' ability or desire to learn and master a high-level curriculum, detracking is not likely to produce the kinds of gains achieved among Southside and Cruz students. Standards and expectations must be raised for all students as well as teachers. These types of attitudinal shifts are necessary for the reform to get off the ground. So I think this is an interesting sort of observation because it sort of brings into focus the importance of changing our thinking about intelligence when we're looking at some of these students and we're thinking about these gaps. So part of what I think our project is going to do is to sort of facilitate that larger shift, okay? So just in a couple of minutes here, let me just sort of share some of this with you. In his insightful and expansive account of American attitudes toward the Negro, 1550 to 1812, historian Winthrop Jordan quoted a defender of the emancipation of African slaves, who in 1776 published his reasoning for why Americans believed they were justified in holding blacks in bondage. Quote, "We have been used to look on them in a mean, contemptible light, and our education has filled us with strong prejudices against them, and has led us to consider them not as our brethren, or in any degree on a level with us, but as quite another species of animals, made only to serve us and our children. and as happy in bondage as in any other state. If we could only divest ourselves of these strong prejudices, which have insensibly fixed on our minds, and consider them as by nature and by right on a level with our brethren and children and those of our neighbors. Around the same time, and just a few years after America declared its independence from the British Crown, Anthony Benzer, based on his experience with his Negro school, declared, quote, that the notion entertained by some that blacks are inferior to whites in their capacities is vulgar prejudice, founded on the pride or ignorance of their lordly masters, who have kept their slaves at such a distance as to be unable to form a right judgment of them. These are lucid illustrations of how the characterization of blacks as innately different from whites, indeed even considered by some pro-slavery thinkers as an entirely different species altogether, was the ideological foundation upon which antebellum racial egalitarianism was erected in colonial America, and was further entrenched after the Declaration of Independence and the establishment of the new nation. The thesis that blacks were inferior to whites and unfit to associate with them without rights that whites were bound to respect was an axiom of law and moral reasoning above dispute, according to U.S. Supreme Court Chief Justice Taney in the infamous Dred Scott decision. But that was far from true. Black enslavement had always been a matter of contention, and not only in the North, but the South as well. And in some instances, critics of slavery, because it was about the tension, right, between those ideals and practices, such as those quoted above, were prepared to locate the source of the problem in white prejudice. Some people, including many Quakers, proposed that overcoming what historian George Friedrichsen calls the black image in the white mind could be best accomplished by educating slaves. Right? So that was going to be to educate slaves to overcome these assumptions of inferiority. Around the turn of the 18th century, a particularly prominent proponent of Negro education was Bostonian James Sullivan. Sullivan was a lawyer, a politician, and a founding member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, who took the strong position that Negro education was the only way to address the problem of slavery. In a 1795 letter to Jeremy Belknap, Sullivan writes, quote, "But there is, in my mind, this resource, and I am obliged to think that it is the only one in the case, and that a very slow one. And there is no way to eradicate, the prejudice which education has fixed in the minds of the white against the black people, otherwise than by raising the blacks by means of mental improvements nearly to the same grade with the whites. The emancipation of the slaves in the United States must be slow in its progress, and ages must be employed in the business. The children of the slaves must, at the public expense, be educated in the same manner as the children of their masters. Being at the same schools, etc., with the rising generation, that prejudice which has been so long and inveterate against them on account of their situation and color, will be lessened within 30 or 40 years. So he was a forward-looking thinker, obviously. So this is 1795, right? Jeremy Belknap Press, Harvard University Press. That's the distinguished brand for Harvard University Press. In this early defense of black education at the close of the 18th century, we find a plea for racial integration in schooling that would not become widespread until well after separate and unequal schooling was declared unconstitutional in 1954.
So 30 or 40 years just passed.
That's right. That's right. It's a long 30, 40 years. But he was forward-looking. James Sullivan was something of a pioneer indeed, even though he grossly underestimated the time that it would take to achieve de jure racial integration and to stamp out the most pernicious forms of anti-black prejudice in the United States. And now some people say we still haven't got there, right? Just go look at the neighborhoods in Philly, right? And you guys got all the data on that. You can just put all the data on the board and we can point to it. But you know what I'm talking about. I just had an excellent conversation with your colleague here, told me a little bit about the situation here in Philadelphia this morning. Sullivan's appeal, however, was based on his optimistic beliefs that blacks could attain higher mental facility enjoyed by whites with the proper public investment in education. Now, as we think about the achievement gap now, you think about this history alongside of it. Much later in the wake of Brown, with the shift in federal policy from a concern with racial integration to the racial achievement gap, a similar optimism inspired Title I, which called for substantive public investment in addressing racial disparities in education. Now, the story sort of gets a bit interesting because there was a lot of optimism here, but this optimism was essentially extinguished by an insidious combination of philosophy and natural science. I was just looking yesterday at the Penn Library. There's this book. I'm going to get my hands on it. I picked it up. It's Ebony and Ivy book about the legacy of slavery. What's the guy's name? Anybody know that? Craig, his last name. But the book is Ebony and Ivy. It's about the history of slavery and higher education in America. Paying special attention to the Ivy League institutions. Interesting. There's a chapter in there of the bodily and mental inferiority of the Negro, right? And showing how the natural sciences of the time were instrumental in cementing the black inferiority thesis and bringing it into the academy and giving it legitimacy and supplanting the dominance of theology, right? The curse of Ham and the stories that were told to justify inferiority back then. Now, one of the things that we want to do in this book is to develop this broader intellectual, historical context. And to do that, I think we got to go all the way back to a very significant philosopher, Aristotle. So you know I can't come here and not talk about philosophy. Right? Yeah, that's not going to happen. That'd be professional malpractice. So now I got to give you a little lecture on Aristotle. You didn't think this was coming, but it was coming. I just had to get your attention. Now I can give you some of the stuff I want to talk about. I want to talk about Aristotle a little bit. I want to talk about Aristotle's qualified egalitarianism, which I think is going to inform the racial egalitarianism of modern Europe and modern America through Jefferson, before Jefferson, Kant, Hume, Hegel. Aristotle, believe it or not, was an egalitarian in a sense. He believed that there should be equality between equals and that treating equals unequally was unjust. But of course, there's a rub. Being a man, or being human for that matter, was not enough to count as an equal during Aristotle's time. Non-Greeks were not equal to Greeks, women were not equal to men, children were not equal to adults, and slaves certainly were not equal to their masters. So there would have been no injustice at all in Plato, Aristotle, and other Greek men of wisdom who were exalted and esteemed for being on the high end of conveniently constructed hierarchies, ruling barbarians, slaves, women, brutes, and others deemed to be devoid or deficient in deliberative, rational intellect. This was the capacity distinctive to human beings that Aristotle utilized to distinguish those fit to rule from those merely fit to serve. In ancient Greece, this qualified egalitarianism further served to articulate the demands of distributive justice, which is primarily concerned with specifying the norms for dividing divisible resources such as wealth, honor, power, and education among individuals within political society. Now, much later, modern Europe and in the United States, qualified egalitarianism did this and much more. Now, in the context of the US, the qualified egalitarianism wasn't simply developed around the notion of intellect, but it was also racialized. And that made it somewhat complicated. But what we want to ultimately argue is that when you take the idea that equality should be for equals and inequality should be unequal, then you have to have some way to distinguish the equals from the unequals. For these philosophers, it was all about the intellect, the mind, right? And even I had some great passage in here. I should at least share this with you, because I abridged this a little bit, because I want to leave a little time for the people to have some questions before you have to leave. But I had a quote in here, basically, from Frederick Douglass, Notes on the State of Virginia. And even Douglass, Thomas Jefferson, even one of the founders of this nation, right? One of the people who authored the grand normative ideals was reluctant to see blacks as having the intellect to justify seeing them as covered by these ideals. So he talked about the great mathematician Benjamin Banneker, right? And he had some doubt, maybe Banneker was the one exception. But then he thought, well, better of it, when he thought maybe it was Banneker's teacher that really had the intelligence, right? So even in that case, we see a diminishment of black intellect and that being used to justify the kind of restricted or qualified egalitarianism. So ultimately, this is really a bridge, but we want to pull together this development coming out of Aristotle, working its way through modern Europe, particularly through the legacy of Kant, David Hume, Hegel, and how it interacts with some of the work that was going on at the time in dividing human species into races, right? 5, 6, depending on who the scientist was. And then how that was further connected with making substantive differences in terms of culture, in terms of intellect. And then that was all used to justify subordination and slavery, right? And what we want to do is sort of put this broader story of race, racial differences, and qualified egalitarianism on the table alongside all this data-driven quantitative work as we think going forward about what kinds of interventions we need, how we need to facilitate these attitudinal shifts to put us in a better position to tackle one of the most significant problems, certainly of our time. Okay, I'll leave it at that. Thank you. So I know a class has to leave, so maybe we could start, if there's some people from the class that have to go at 1, maybe we could start with questions from you guys. Be good? Yes, sir?
Yeah, I had a question. One of the thoughts I had when reading your research questions was, maybe this presupposes a question, why should we care about racial achievement gaps, period, not just the origin? Because the goal here, if the goal is from a social justice perspective, it does seem that closing the racial achievement gap is completely compatible with a very inequitable society. I think you can look at the situation with whites. If you take that as a group, there are extreme social inequities, even though you are comparing them to, as a whole, their racial or their achievement scores are higher than black. So what is the goal of closing the racial achievement gap?
That's an excellent question. Now, one way we might get to that conclusion, however, is by looking at this broader story about the origins. So if one consequence of that story is that it makes us think that that shouldn't be the goal, then that gives us some material that we didn't quite have on the table and a justification about why we might come to that position. Now, but more substantively, this is a very good observation. Maybe you shouldn't be surprised to hear this, but I'll just tell you because he makes this point. If you look at the philosophical literature on egalitarianism, what you'll find is that most modern day egalitarians don't really have a problem with inequality per se, right? So you think the most significant figure is John Rawls, political philosopher John Rawls, who influenced, the contemporary discussion on social justice. Now, Rawls was concerned that the inequalities that there are be such that they work to the benefit of the least well off. But that's perfectly compatible with there being inequalities. Now, his position was complicated because he was worried some inequalities, for example, were a problem if they translated into differences in political power. So, for example, if people that were very wealthy had better access to politics to shape law and policy, that's something that should be undone. And so Rawls would advocate for campaign finance reform, for example, to deal with that. But other people who are doing some of the most interesting work from an egalitarian perspective in philosophy of education will say, look, so long as people can have a sense of self-worth, be looked upon as an equal, that's compatible with some people having higher educational achievement, right? And better outcomes. So they don't want to undo inequality. But my own view is that an egalitarian should not be prepared to live with the homogeneity, that is all the blacks being here, all the whites being here, or Latinos, or poor, or rich. That's something we shouldn't live with. So my concern is about the lack of diversity on either ends of these inequality gaps. But most egalitarians are prepared to live with the gaps themselves, right? And I think that can be tricky if you see that all people from a certain demographic are on either ends or either extremes of these gaps. So point, I think if this story gets you to think that inequality shouldn't matter as much as we think, that could be progress. But also the point that you make, I think, is an excellent point about what should we really care about as egalitarians? What should be the object of our concern? Anybody else from the class? Yeah.
So an interesting point that I think you brought up is the fact that a lot of the early thinkers on educating African Americans in the country, it seems that they put the onus on funding public education so that African Americans would have the ability to pull themselves up without kind of juxtaposing or making it a comparable education to the whites who would then keep them in kind of that bondage. Because as much as African Americans may have the privilege of being able to have higher mental faculties, if kind of the social reproduction of African Americans can't achieve intellectual prowess is kind of reinforced into the white society, then how are those things compatible? So it's just really interesting how we ignore racial and cultural literacy and the understanding of what it means for white people as well as African Americans. So if African Americans need to develop their mental faculties, well then maybe the majority needs to develop their cultural and racial literacy.
Well, that's a profound point. Some of the work that I've done in the last couple of years has been with a colleague at Kansas who's Nyla Branscombe. She's a social psychologist. And she pointed out, and then some work that I did teaching last couple of years, teaching a couple of sections on racial profile, talking about this idea of racial literacy. People focus a lot of attention on what the oppressed or the subordinated need to do, how we could fix them up so that they could shake this stuff off and move forward. But that doesn't put any focus on people who are in a position to benefit from the way opportunity structures are set up and what they might do to sort of not be an obstacle. And that's to put it a mile way, right? Just to not be an obstacle, right? Or to understand their place in the largest structure of opportunity. And there are people doing work in social psychology that say how our thinking about justice and equality are very much informed by our social identities as advantaged people, disadvantaged men, women, people of color, people in the majority. And that research, I think, helped bring out some of the challenges that we face in trying to do the kind of thing you point out. Excellent. Any other people from the class? Good, we got a couple minutes. Any other people from the class? No? Well, thanks for joining me today. I sure appreciate it.
We will sleep out and let the other people take over the conversation.
Okay, I'll see you later, yeah. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you.
And I'm only halfway in.
Okay, take care. Take care now. Yeah. Okay, bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Okay.
Yes. Okay? The rest of you are not dismissed. Just detention. Detention. So yeah. Please.
Sure. So thank you for your talk. Really fruitful and a lot of things that's helpful for me with thinking about some of the issues I've been thinking about recently. So I guess my question is sort of twofold. The first question is just sort of asking how you see Aristotle qualified egalitarianism differ from the sort of Rawlsian principle of fair equality opportunity. And the second part is just going to ask about the sort of dichotomy that you mentioned and between sort of motivation and sort of talents. And I want to see I want to sort of speak about it in this sort of dichotic way and see if you sort of accept that.
Well, let me just get the first one, and then you can set up the second question. So, in terms of Aristotle's qualified egalitarianism and Rawlsian fair equality of opportunity, that was you want to know how those things compare or contrast?
Right. So, yes, because the reason initially, I mean, so much of what you say, you seem to be sort of critical of Rawls, right? Where Rawls will say the first principle of justice is the basic structure.
I didn't say I was critical of Rawls. You didn't say that one time in my talk.
Not at all, but it
Right.
but what you said alluded to, right? Because Rawls will say the first principle of justice is the basic structure of society. You would probably say, well, no, it's a lot deeper than structural issues. We also have to consider the sort of cultural and familial issues, which a lot of people, i.e. Cohen, and for example, would say that this goes beyond the principle of the Rawlsian principle of justice. So this is a separate issue, the sort of social justice.
Okay, so here's what I'll say, and no, this is not really critical of Rawls, so to speak, but one of the things we do have to do, and Rawls made this distinction for us, is he distinguished between ideal theory and non-ideal theory. Right? Now, Rawls was trying to come up with ideal principles that should govern the terms of our social cooperation. And, as a student of history of philosophy, particularly the social contract tradition, he developed a model for arriving at these principles that basically said, look, what we want ultimately, if we're going to cooperate with each other, is a sense that we're all playing by the same rules and that the rules are fair. Now, if we want to arrive at fair rules, then we're going to have to make sure that we can't use details about who we are, what kind of person we're going to be in the construction of those rules. Because then that's going to create an opportunity for creating rules that are going to favor us in some way. So he made a minimal set of assumptions about persons. And he used that to come up with this heuristic device to model a set of rules. And the rules are the two principles of justice. And the second principle, of course, is split. Now that's the project in ideal theory. And those rules give us something to aim for. Now, what happens under non-ideal conditions is a different matter. Now, we can get non-ideal conditions in one of two ways. We can have manifest evil in the world, right? Where people can basically do things that bring about injustice. Or we can have cases where people are just unlucky due to their circumstances. Both open up questions in the space of non-ideal theory. And Rawls didn't tackle that because he realized that tackling those issues had a lot to do with empirical matters. And so you have to bring the social scientists, for example, into the conversation. Now, I'm interested in doing that kind of work, right? And so that's not really against Rawls. It's just extending the discussion about justice in political philosophy in ways that force us to grapple with empirical realities like racism, like the legacy of discrimination, like the impact that people's choices have on their circumstances. So there you want to talk to social psychologists, among other kinds of scholars. So I don't really have a problem with Rawls in that way. Now, with respect to qualified egalitarianism, here's the way it gets qualified today. The post-Rawlsian egalitarian literature, as you may know, was sort of generated by Ronald Dworkin, G.A. Cohen, and others. And one of the things that was very crucial for that literature is distinguishing between people's choices, things that they were seen to be in control of, versus their circumstances. And the egalitarian argument of today is that if people's predicament is largely due to their choices, then there's no issue of justice to be raised. If it's due to their circumstances, that's a different matter. Egalitarian intervention is justified. The story that we want to tell is going to take this appeal to choice, which some people rely heavily on, particularly in the context of these cultural explanations, and locate it in this broader continuum of thinking about the diminishment of humanity, black humanity in particular, that goes all the way back to qualified racial egalitarianism in a way that I sort of tried to outline in the talk. So that's the connection between qualified egalitarianism and the qualified egalitarianism of today, where choices now get kind of racialized. If you go look at some of Larry Bogle's work and other work that's being done in the social sciences, you'll see that when people think about what's wrong, the survey question is, how do we account for black disadvantage? What's wrong with what should we say about injustice today? People appeal to deficient choices or lack of effort and so forth and so on. It's racialized.
No, that's very helpful. Thanks. Yeah. So ultimately, that's what I was sort of getting at, right? When I said you alluded to being a jack of roles, but
yeah.
It's really the sort of non-ideal
yes.
theory, saying, well, you know, he seems to get it wrong, thinking that these sort of issues could get resolved by doing sort of non-ideal project or ideal project. But really what we need to do is ideal theory. I mean, ultimately, in a longer discussion, I would really ask you how you differ from your new colleague Elizabeth Anderson, who wrote a lot on these issues. It seems like you're sympathetic to a lot of things that she said.
We are sympathetic in some ways, but we all will fight about some things too.
Fair enough.
and she's fantastic, right? Because she certainly has been a trailblazer in this work.
Right. So just getting to the second part of the question was just simply, so Rawls gives us this fair equality of opportunity principle, which he says that those who are equally talented, one, talented, and two, motivated should have the same access to career choices and educational opportunities, right? And the sort of the literature that you sort of mentioned very briefly in the discussion seemed to tackle those two questions separately. We can sort of put Freier's work under the motivation side, right? Where Freier is basically saying, well, the reason that why these minority children aren't really succeeding is because they're not motivated. And a lot of people will think, well, how do we motivate them? A lot of other non-minority children are just simply motivated by their family structure, right? Mm-hmm. Their families are put in a structure in which education is seen as this primary good, and they ought to go towards it. And Freier may suggest, well, at least he may not say this explicitly, but the thought behind that seems to be, well, we can motivate people who don't have this sort of family structure with money, and that's sort of problematic for all sorts of reasons. You think that that's a motivating feature, but then the other literature, I think it was Tyson that you mentioned, seemed to talk about talents, where it's like, well, what's really wrong isn't the motivation, but it's what counts as a talent. Like she wanted to sort of say that it's what we consider to be smart or intelligent in the society. So we don't really have to alter people's motivation. We just really restructure what we see as a talent or intelligent in the society. And both of those seem to be tackling two different questions. I don't know if you see one as more important than the other, or is that?
Well, that I'm not going to give you. See, that's the thing, right? Because you and I were talking about this earlier today. I mean, people like simplicity, right? So the question of which one is more fundamental, which one is more basic, I'm not going to go there, right? Because it's complicated. I want to say that's my answer. It's complicated. And so what we need to do is challenge ourselves to come up with a complicated story about what we need to be doing that reflects the complexity of the problem. But I'm not going to give you this or that is more fundamental.
Right.
But what I will tell you is that
question as philosophers should we be pursuing first? Or is it all under the same umbrella?
You should be doing the hard work is what you should be doing, right? You should be you should be appreciating the complexity of the problem of inequality. And you think about the story you need to tell about responsibility, the story you need to tell about justice that reflects that complexity. And what that's going to look like, if it's going to get you on CNN for a quick soundbite, I can't say. But is it going to create some work that's going to have a lasting impact? I know it will. For people that take the time to do it. I mean, but it's not going to, I can't give you 140 characters on this one.
Thank you.
Dean.
So it's my impression anyway, this may not quite be a fact, that inequality from the perspective of people who deliver and write policies about education, used to focus on opportunity more, and now focuses more on outcomes.
Yeah.
And I just wondered, so that shift happened somewhere in there. Actually, I think I know roughly when it happened. So is that a good thing? And if so, why?
Okay. If you think that the story to be told about why the outcomes differ is a complicated story, then it may well be a good thing. Because part of what happened before was, as I was saying, and sort of the way I set up the story, it was very easy to think prior to Brown, right? There was a lack of opportunity. And you had the lack of opportunity, and then you got the outcomes you had. But the opportunity was, they couldn't even go into the door, right? So it was very concrete. After Brown, some people did get into the door. But then there people came along, people like, think about some of Ronald Ferguson's work, and earlier work on Shaker Heights and the suburbs, and people who were thinking about achievement gaps in suburban school districts and still finding evidence of racial achievement gaps. So there we got middle-class families, but we're still having stratification. Well, we could get in the door, but now that might lead us to look at other things like tracking, for example, or like teacher interactions with students, other things that now might be making the difference. So if you think that those kinds of things matter, particularly in a post-civil rights world, then you're going to want to talk, you're going to want to look at those outcomes. But for me, the outcomes, if they're unequal, are evidence that there are obstacles to people realizing their potential. And we're going to leave it to the social scientists when it comes to policy interventions. But when we're thinking about what's required to do justice to inequality, we have to be taking on board, it seems to me, the full array of knowledge that we have at our disposal. Now, I don't know if that gets at what you were, because I don't quite, I mean, you just gave it to me in terms of outcomes and opportunity, but that's what I would say. If you think the story is complex, then the shift to outcomes is good, because the bad outcomes suggest that there's problems still. But if you think that opportunity is just formal in nature, then you might think that is going to be a distraction. Because we don't need to be talking about this other stuff. We just need to be talking about the ways in which we still have discrimination. We're still living with formal obstacles. You see?
Yeah, so would you say then that, so educators are in the business of trying to deliver services, improve people's life chances and that kind of thing.
Okay.
So would you say that a strategy might be then inequality in opportunity to create equality in outcomes?
Say it again.
Inequality in opportunity to create equality in outcomes. So, for example, give a better quality education to somebody than to somebody else, so that in the end, the two would have the same outcome. I'm not saying that that's the answer. I'm just saying, is that, I don't know, when it comes to inequality, there's always kind of like a question of what's right and wrong, or good and evil, usually, in there somewhere. And so I'm just wondering, I'm in some conversations with the director of the W.T. Grant Foundation right now on that question.
Yeah, I'd have to sort of hear more, because as I was just saying in response to one of the earlier questions, I mean, most sort of modern day philosophical egalitarians are not going to immediately say that inequality is an evil thing, right? They're going to sort of place certain conditions, or they want to say we don't want to have inequality if it means that people are going to be humiliated, they're going to be dehumanized, they're going to be viewed as less than another person. And then there are people who want to argue that there's nothing wrong with some people, for example, from impoverished backgrounds or other backgrounds getting better or more educational opportunity. If you believe that by drawing people from different walks of life, when they do get to positions of power and authority, they're going to govern or they're going to discharge their offices in ways that are going to work to the benefit of people that come from the circumstances they came out of. But this, of course, is also an empirical question, right? But some people will argue for differences in education, allow for it, but do it with the faith that when this person makes it to Congress, or when this person makes it to the Supreme Court, or when this person makes it to the dean of the Graduate School of Education at Harvard or Penn, that they're going to discharge their office in ways that are going to redound to the benefit of others. Now, is that going to happen? Can we count on that reliably happening that way? I don't know. I think that this sort of ideology of choice is very pervasive. So I think we got to be careful of what happens to people when they get social mobility of a certain sort. What happens to their interests? Are they the same interests that they had starting out before they ascended the ladder? I think there's some serious questions here we got to raise before we can have that kind of confidence. But some people might think that you can have this certain measure of inequality, and it might generate better outcomes because people in power are ultimately going to govern or conduct themselves in certain ways. I don't know if that gets at your question at all.
Well, there are two kinds of people in this world, simplifiers and complexifiers.
I'm a complexifier.
Yeah, right. And having said that, you know what I am.
Yeah, I'm a complexifier. Yeah.
So I was looking for something a little simpler.
Yeah. That's why you don't see the philosophers on CNN, point counterpoint, because it's going to take too much time and effort. So people want time and effort. I need 140 characters, right? Can you tweet that to me?
I can't.
Yeah, I can't tweet it to you. I'm sorry.
Derrick, so
Yeah.
I have a different version of Andy's question.
Okay.
I think. Right, so there has been this effort to try to figure out what to do to improve outcomes,
Yes.
say for students in urban schools.
Yes.
And students in urban schools disproportionately are Black and Latino,
Right.
and they live in poverty.
Right.
Right? So there's been like a lot of musing about, well, what do we do to improve outcomes for those students to make them comparable to their white, more affluent peers who tend to be overrepresented in independent schools, in predominantly white suburban schools, and so on, right? So a simple answer to that question has been, well, if you do for them educationally what you do for the white kids in these other school spaces, then we will see less evidence of inequities and outcomes. Is that something that you believe?
Is that an empirical claim? Who gives us the knowledge to make that claim? What discipline at the university gives us the knowledge to answer that question?
Well, I would imagine
because the question might be, right? The question might be that I could tell you which social scientists, like if I'm looking at racial, I tell you, okay, go read some William Julius Wilson on inequality, and then you whatever his story is about inequality, you get that story, right? What's that question? That seems to be a straightforward empirical claim.
Well, I would argue that the empirical evidence, the quantitative evidence especially, would suggest that students in school environments that are structured in a particular way. Low rates of teacher turnover.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
Higher incomes, smaller learning environments.
Credential differences, for example.
Credential differences,
Yeah,
right?
good.
So when you take those factors, they tend to be disproportionately located in certain educational spaces.
Yeah.
Right? So I think that's where this then becomes sort of an empirical claim that, well, if you had highly educated, well-paid, very stable teachers and a teaching workforce and an administrative workforce in these schools like you have in the others,
Right.
that we would see less of these sort of quantifiable inequities.
Well, again, if you want, I'm happy to sign up for that program. I'm happy. That's what I'll say. I said, that sounds good to me, but I certainly don't have the expertise to get to that conclusion. You see what I'm saying? This is what I was telling you earlier about the collaborative work. I'm happy to sit down with somebody who has done the work, right, to justify that conclusion. I could have gave you very simple. I mean, if you want it simple, I could have said, solve poverty. I could say that. I could just say poverty. Fix poverty, you fix the problem with education. That's simple. But we know that it's complicated. That's too simple. Right? But I could have said it. I could have said, just go fix poverty and you fix the problem. Your answer was simple. It said, make the circumstances for children in these schools more like what white kids have. You can fix the problem. I mean, we know some of what that means, but again, there you have to now align yourself with the data folks, it seems to me, right? Because this doesn't seem like it's not an a priori claim. So that was my original point. I mean, there's a division of labor. It has to happen. So
Can you say a little bit more about aligning oneself with the data folks?
Okay.
Because that might be one of those.
If one makes the claim that, somebody who's done a lot of work on, he's been, at least the Times has been liking Sean Reardon stuff, right? I mean, he's been making a point somewhat similar to this, right? If you create a middle class situation for these kids, and you got family support, you got homework, you take away the stresses out of the house, you fill in the story. We know how it gets filled in. This should produce better outcomes. And so some people take that point to say, well, see, I told you it's not race really, it's about class. So you simulate a middle class lifestyle for every kid like my daughters had. And then you should get some really good outcomes. Now, that seems to me not to be an a priori claim. That seems to be a claim that is a hypothesis that has to be tested, right, and argued for in some kind of way. Now, I haven't done that work. So one question might be, well, whose work do you like on this? That could be a kind of question, right? And I mean, I tend to sort of, as Dean already exposed me, he said there are two kinds of people in the world, simplifiers and complexifiers. I'm a complexifier, I'm a philosopher. It's what I do. It's more complex. But what I want to say then is that now here's room for collaboration. So I can go work with Sean Reardon, and he's got this data, and he says if you make the middle class environment universal, then you're going to get better outcomes. Okay, well, you got this empirical work, let's see what it looks like. Let's see what the critics had to say about it, how it holds up, and then bring this together and make a broader point about what our obligations are as a society from the standpoint of justice. That's assuming certain facts obtained.
It's one of the things that I did very much, one of several things that I very much appreciated about your talk, is that you did in fact do some incredible name dropping along the way. Yeah. And I think that is the right answer, right? That right answer to the question of, well, who's thinking do you like best on this, right? It's a little bit of this, it's a little bit of that.
That's right.
That, and I love that this was such an interdisciplinary talk. So the people that you named along the way, they're not all located in one discipline, but they come from different genres, different epistemological and methodological positions and approaches. So I think that there's a lot in that approach of bringing those perspectives to the table.
And you gotta be careful once you step outside of your discipline. I mean, this is your territory. I'm in the School of Education, right? I mean, I've been in schools of law, I've been in schools of medicine. People doing different things, different methodology, different bodies of knowledge. But what I do believe is that there are problems that hold us together as people living in society. Issues of justice, inequality, hold us together, right? And so the question for me is, how do I become part of a larger intellectual conversation where there's an intellectual division of labor brought to bear in thinking about these problems of common concern? But I have to be have to do it with some humility, right? Because, I mean, I have my expertise. Things that I don't have expertise on, I'm just more hesitant on. I read, just like everybody else, and I got my favorites, but I'm just a bit more hesitant, right? About certain things.
I think that your philosophical approach helps us to think about the morality involved in our scholarship. And I appreciate that because sometimes in conducting scientific work, you can get caught up into one lens in terms of looking at the world. So the philosophical approach helps to disconnect from that a little bit and to help us grapple with the morality, the moral questions, the moral fiber of the work. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about your book. I'm intrigued by the philosophical and historical connection. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the timeline that you focus on in the book.
Okay, excellent question. So my colleague, John Rury, is he's the educational historian. And the timeline that we're going to be looking at is basically the early 19th century through the present. Now, that's for the historical stuff about race, focusing on the U.S. in particular. So, I mean, pro-slavery ideology really was at its height around 1820, 1830, right, leading up to the Civil War. And then when you think about post-slavery, and you think about Reconstruction, and you think about the ascendancy of eugenics, right, that was early part of the 20th century. So he's going to cover that period up to the present, historically. And I'm going to bring into focus stuff that was taking place in the 18th century in philosophy and in the natural sciences through the work of Kant, Jung, and the impact that Blumenbach and others had on their thinking, ethically and politically, about the different races of mankind. And I'm going to sort of point to Aristotle as sort of a theoretical foundation for qualified egalitarianism. But of course, the ancient Greeks weren't thinking about race like we do today, so that's not going to be the claim. It's just that equality for equals, inequality for unequals. And then what happens is as the story develops, who gets to be an equal and who gets to be an unequal is going to become racialized by the time we get to modern Europe and into America. So that would be the time frame. Yeah.
I have an extension actually of my colleague's question here.
Yes.
And it's about the question of sort of morality here.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
As I noted before, people have been sort of scrambling to figure out what works.
Yeah.
Well,
yeah.
well, we.
And they're not going to the philosophers to find out. That was the thing I started with. That's the point. They're not looking for. They're not. Although the World Bank had me out 2 years ago, as I told you, they wanted me to talk to some economists about issues of morality and justice. But anyway, not for what works.
But there is quite a bit of evidence about the kinds of practices, policies, structures, and so on that do in fact work educationally, right? But yet there is not a political will to make equitable access to those things. Is that something that you take up in your work, the political will,
I think
or lack thereof?
I think my work can speak to why there might be a lack of it.
Say more about that. Why might there be a political unwillingness to do more of what works in the places where
Because
it's most needed?
Well, first of all, okay, let's just sort of say we're having a conversation, not quite over coffee, but it's one of those over coffee night conversations. So for me, that's just my way of saying, okay, this is not so rigorous, but I'm gonna say it anyway. Man, that's complicated. that's. I don't want to make it complicated though. But here's one answer to that. I mean, there are plenty of people that benefit from inequality. Right? I mean, that would be the start of the conversation. So that's the first point. And y'all know where I would go with it if it was rigorous, but that's the first point.
But where would education be without it? You know.
And then the second thing is, how do you move things politically? How do you get movement politically? We were kind of, in a way, having this conversation earlier. How does movement happen politically? Well, I mean, this is Philadelphia. I mean, you power the people. I guess maybe in some sense we still believe that. So you got to move people to get them in a certain direction politically. Now, I think the question I started to talk with, what can humanists bring to the table? Right? Here's where I think humanists, they have some work, they have some important work they can do to help frame questions and problems, put things in a certain kind of perspective, to maybe move people in ways that can ultimately generate political will in an environment where people benefit from the status quo. It's not like nobody's not benefiting from it.
Derrick, that's gonna have to be the final word.
And that's going to be the final word. Yeah.